Yeah, sure. Why don't the politicians sit at the table? Well, we want to do this first, though. This is from Michael for her leadership of the Maryland Legislative Agenda for Women and Law, and her work on domestic violence issues. And it's from Maryland Now, and we really, really appreciate the decades of work. I won't say how many, but it's lots. So Michael is going to talk a little bit about MLaw, and then we're going to have Delegate Washington interview. Feed the questions to the honorees.
What I wanted to talk about was collaboration and collective action, because that's the way that we've achieved legislative success in Maryland. And I want to start out by talking about my experience with domestic violence, because I think it's a really good example of how this has worked so effectively. The domestic violence movement began in the 1970s when advocates and survivors who saw domestic violence as a serious societal problem began to establish shelters and counseling programs. Many were begun in Maryland during that time. And I moved to Maryland in 1976, so I was really right in the middle of that effort. And I became involved in the YWCA Women's Center in Annapolis, where I volunteered, and then I became the director for about 15 and a half years. And we created a domestic violence program in 1977. And that grew out of our counseling services when the counselors began to recognize this as a very specific issue that a lot of our clients were facing. At the time, domestic violence was a hidden problem. It was considered a private family matter. It was an issue that few public officials wanted to address or be associated with, and intervention was seen as breaking up families. In 1980, the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence was created by women advocates, domestic violence service providers who had started those programs, and survivors who recognized the need to work together to achieve a change in laws and attitudes toward domestic violence. I was one of the founders, and one of the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence primary goals was legislative advocacy, and that was true from the beginning. After serving on the board of the Maryland Network for about 18 years, I became the executive director in 1999 and served in that position until the fall of last year. Our sister organization, the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault, MCASA, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, was created around the same time. And many of the programs that were created were actually dual programs. They served both domestic violence and sexual assault victims. And that's even truer now. A lot of them have merged. And so the majority of the programs in Maryland do serve both. Between 1980 and 2017, 129 pieces of legislation related to domestic violence have been passed. And now, many legislators are eager to sponsor and support this kind of legislation. Sometimes they even include it in their advertisements when they run for office, which I find very interesting. But the passage of these laws has really been difficult and very incremental. I like to remind people that it took 17 years to go from a 15-day protective order in 1980 to one that was 1 year with possibility of a 6-month extension in 1997. And it increased a little bit. Over those years, we went, to 30 days, 6 months. I mean, it was really hard, but we did it. But it was because people were really committed to working together. So there's a list actually outside of the table of all of the legislation that has been passed related to domestic violence since 1980. And it's an amazing list. We've made a lot of progress. We still have a ways to go, but a lot has changed in Maryland since that The Maryland Network also not only nurtured legislative and advocacy, but we nurtured leadership. And two of the board members of the Maryland Network were elected to the House of Delegates, Sharon Grosfeld and Sue Hecht, many of you remember them, and Sharon was subsequently elected to the Senate, and they came directly out of their work with domestic violence and the Maryland Network. Meanwhile, many advocates working on women's issues recognize the interconnectedness as well as the obstacles that continue to challenge women and families in Maryland: economic, child care, health care, legal, as well as domestic and sexual violence. In the early 1990s, a group of women advocates, including Carolyn Bates from the Junior League and members of the Maryland Commission for Women, along with the YWCA Women's Center, arranged a meeting in Annapolis to talk about the creation of a statewide coalition to address women's issues. I was one of the initiators of the meeting, and the result was the legislative agenda for Maryland women, LAMW. Several large statewide conferences were held over the next few years, and energized advocates and legislators met in work groups to explore ideas and create legislative proposals. In 1994 and 1995, two comprehensive domestic violence bills were introduced and passed in the Maryland General Assembly. They were LAMW's first successful bills. Now, it didn't hurt that at the same time there had been enormous publicity about the O.J. Simpson trial. So that really moved us significantly forward in making people aware of this critical issue. For the next 10 years, LAMW supported many successful bills, and the group received immeasurable help and support from the Maryland Commission for Women. However, in 2004, the Maryland Commission for Women had to withdraw its support. Instead of folding, some key legislators, including Senator Dolores Kelly, at an infamous meeting in her office, I remember that, and some committed advocates decided to create an independent organization to continue this valuable work. And we became the Maryland Legislative Agenda for Women, MLAW. MLAW is a 501c4 organization with a board of directors and an established process for creating an annual legislative agenda. Between 1994 and 2017, 83 bills that have been included on the legislative agenda have been passed by the General Assembly. And I think this is a remarkable measure of success. And there is also a list out there, if any of you are interested, of all of the pieces of legislation that have passed. MLAW is one of the few statewide nonpartisan legislative coalitions in the United States devoted to advocacy for women's and family issues. It's a model for the country. And I've been privileged to serve as the president since 2006. The past 2 years have been especially exciting for MLAW, as women across the state have become increasingly energized and interested in political activism. Our annual fall conference and winter legislative reception and briefing have attracted almost 200 women at each event, doubling our previous attendance. After 24 years, we are enormously excited about the interest and involvement of so many activists. And it really has been satisfying to see that happen. I think as a result of what's happened at the national level. I don't think we can take sole credit for that, but it's really been exciting. So working together through coalition and collective action, the women of Maryland have demonstrated their collective power. And this year, with increased energy and commitment, we can be even more successful. So I encourage you to look at the MLAW issues on this year's agenda and take action. And there's information outside again about what those issues are. And I'd be happy then afterwards to answer any questions about the particular issues. But I know that some of our panelists are going to refer to some of them because they're sponsors. Thank you.
It's an honor. Hello, Delegate Mary Washington. I represent the 43rd Legislative District in Baltimore City. I'm the moderator for this panel, and same table, not only with Michelle Cohen and hear this wonderful history, but also my colleagues, Senator Boris Kelly and Delegate Kathleen Dumais, who both, honestly, if not for their work and trailblazing work for all of us, so many of the rights that we do have in this state would not exist. And also in a position now when so many of those rights that we've developed or that they fought for over the last 30 years are being attacked at the national level and sometimes at the state level. My colleagues to the left are right at the front door, on the front lines, ensuring that we don't slip back. So what we'd like to do is with this panel, since we do have some time, would it be to just spend maybe the first 15 minutes or so. I'm going to ask a couple questions that really just speak to our path, just how each of us got to where we are, and then maybe talk about some of the challenges that we face along the way, some understandings of what is forward for people that are interested in doing some of the work. And then each of us will share a piece of legislation to show that we're working on that we believe is of interest. And if there's some time, which I will do my best to make sure that there's about at least 8 minutes at the end, for there to be any questions from the audience. And that seems like a good way to proceed. So I would just start to our far left. And we're sitting in order of seniority, so just so that you know, this is kind of... I did that.
Oh my goodness.
I did that. So again, not that one is better than the other, but I think it's fair and of value to recognize the status and the place where people have achieved. So I'm going to start with Senator Kelly and just ask, can you briefly give us a sense of how you got to where you are, your leadership position that you currently hold?
Well, let me say that
Or whatever you
at the moment, all of the younger people that I meet are running against me. They say, in fact, that I'm too old. So this is the year in which I have to show if I'm too old or not. I guess I was always a troublemaker. I loved debate when I was in college, and my first real job was at Morgan, where I coached debate and got involved in demonstrations at the State House when I was an untenured English professor just coaching debate back in 1970 when Perrin Mitchell decided that he would organize students to try to get back $1 million that had been cut from Morgan's budget. And I didn't see any grown people involved except for Perrin. So I decided to organize faculty, and all of those with tenure sat back and kind of looked. So I organized the untenured people at the time, and we went down on a cold day in February, took a bus load of untenured people. We marched around and around, and as it turned out, Senator Rosalie Abrams, who was the first woman ever appointed as a standing chair in the Maryland General Assembly to anything, and she was chair of the Finance Committee, which at that time was the Budget Committee. And she finally came out about 4 o'clock, we could barely stand it, and said, I'd like a couple of representatives to come inside. She knew what I was doing. She was in my district. But anyway, we went in and discussed the issue and had the committee's agreement that we deserved our $1 million back even if they couldn't do more that year. So I decided, yeah, we should be empowered if we stand up for ourselves. Back in '92, when there was the Question Q referendum on abortion, women's right to choose, it was the Planned Parenthood of Maryland that gave me the job to go to the Baltimore City Ministerial Alliance, which used to have monthly meetings at a Morning Star Baptist Church on Fayette Street. And about 100 of them would go in there and eat fried chicken and ham and stuff like that. And I don't know what else they normally did, but they agreed that we could come. And we made our case, and we barely got their endorsement, but we got it. There were 93 ministers there that day. And it was the elder ministers who voted with us. The young ones had never heard of back alley abortions. They knew nothing about the struggles that women had gone through, and men in their lives in some cases. And so one of my worries following that, when we got the referendum through, was, and it sticks in the back of my mind now, we must raise up a new generation, because the young people in charge do not know the battles that were fought nor what the conditions were that led to those battles. And so when we see what at the national level is happening, no matter what our persuasion or our area of partisanship, a president who is clearly ignorant of much of the history of the country and certainly women's issues, and without a lot of respect for the autonomy and the personhood of women, I think we all need to be emboldened to begin again and to realize that nothing is forever unless we keep it alive. And so we've got work to do.
So, well, first, Mary sort of shortchanged herself. She's arrived full steam ahead when she was elected, and seniority or not, she's got a lot to her credit, which I know she'll talk a little bit about. And it's my absolute pleasure to be on the panel with Michael as well as Senator Kelly. Senator Kelly and I are very, pleased is a little bit difficult, but we are both vice chairs of the judicial committees in the Senate and the House. And although there have been women in these positions before, I think the two of us are in a very important role at a very important time. I've been in the legislature since 2003. I was elected for the first time in 2002. So unbelievably, it's been 16 years. And I often talk about when I was, and I wanted to be on the Judiciary Committee, which we often talk about being the infamous Judiciary Committee. But in my other world, I'm a practicing attorney. And I handle family law cases, domestic violence cases, custody, and that's where my concentration is. So I wanted to be on the committee that was going to handle the legislation and the laws of my practice. And what I often talk about when I speak to young women or wherever, through my practice, I have been very fortunate to work with incredible people and really have not, in my practice, felt gender bias or have been sexually harassed. But I arrived to the House Judiciary Committee in 2003 and felt like I walked into 1950. It was, not necessarily the fault of anyone, but the legislature is still very heavily male. It was particularly heavily male when I arrived. And the Judiciary Committee was the epitome of the old boys network. And they looked at, when Michael just went through sort of the successes we've had in domestic violence and family law issues. Here's the reaction that the old boy network would have when we bring these bills. Oh my God, we have to listen to women's issues now. Oh my God, and I often had a lot of bills. It's Dumay Day. Oh gosh, reach the point, and many of the advocates, not necessarily all, but many of the advocates on these issues are women. So one of my colleagues, who's not in the legislature anymore, decided that it was the Sisterhood Day. The Sisterhood's here to testify. And again, I've been practicing law for, 20 years by the time I was elected, and this kind of denigration, for lack of any other word, was foreign to me. So, in response to your question about how to get here and what made you want to do this, I love listening to things, sort of Dolores Kelly talking about what her passions were. And my passion was making a difference. Curiously, my father was a principal of a high school, similar to our last speaker. And what he always said, exactly as she said, what he wanted to do and what he encouraged, I'm the oldest of 8, all of us to do was to make a difference. And so I got the state government bug when I was in high school. I served as a page in the Maryland House of Delegates. And, thought at some point, and even then, my career allowed, I wanted to be in the House of Delegates. It was fascinating for me. We all, actually, it's interesting, the counties and jurisdictions still sit almost in the exact same place now that they did when I was a page in 1976. Baltimore City is in the exact same place on the floor. Montgomery County is in the exact same place. But as a page, I didn't understand a lot about state government. But what always struck me is Maryland's a mini America. We have the ocean and the mountains, and we have the bay, and we have cities, and we have, agricultural centers. And I just thought it was fascinating to sort of, Baltimore City, not very many women at that point, 3-piece Brook Brothers suits, sitting out front, talking about the budget, which in fairness went right over my head. But then the next bill that was on the floor was what was the most humane way to kill a raccoon, because it was a farm issue. And I just thought that sort of epitomized what it is to be in the legislature, is you are affecting the citizens of Maryland and your neighbors' lives. That's what I wanted to do, and that's what I wanted to help make a difference about. So that's sort of, my path, and I've worked a great deal with Michael on the network and the House of Ruth and the Women's Law Center, and I just saw Michelle come in. So there's still a lot to do. And there is still a lot of misunderstanding about how laws affect women. And we need your voices. So thank you for inviting me today. I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
So yes, I'm Delegate Mary Washington, and I was elected in 2010. And when that happened, I became the first African American elected to the state legislature. I currently still hold that distinction, not only being the only out lesbian, but just in general, anyone that out in the Maryland General Assembly who identifies as same-gender loving. I also had a path of, initially before coming to the state legislature, I was a professor. I still am an adjunct professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art. I received my sociology degree at Johns Hopkins in 1996. And I had actually planned on being an analyst or a demographer of some sort, or being a university professor. I mean, right now I should have tenure. I should probably be on a sabbatical somewhere, studying late 19th century population statistics. And what did those census enumerators think they were doing when they were assigning racial categories in the 1880 census, which is what my dissertation is on. However, at the same time, during my graduate studies, or actually even as an undergraduate, I was part of the Rainbow Push Coalition to register voters in the summer of 1984, doing the Jesse Jackson and Rainbow Push summer, and spent the summer in New Jersey registering voters. Continued as in my undergraduate year to came into development over time during the Reagan administration, when Title IX was being cut, when Pell Grants were being cut, when the voices of that silent minority that was supposed to be, had been underrepresented while all of us were moving forward in trying to push our rights. I was coming of age in a time where it was, yes, about gaining additional rights, particularly for our LGBT community, but when it came to maintaining the rights of my status as an African American, maintaining the rights of my status as a woman. I grew up in a time of, when people talk about intersectionality, I lived that every day. And that my career, my political awareness, my economic awareness, all of that comes to that intersectionality, that it's not simply about women's rights or simply about rights of people of color, not simply about LGBT rights, and now today, not simply about immigration rights. And all of these are things that come together. And so I was the first president on my campus of something we formed called the Progressive Student Alliance, which was, I was at a college in Western PA, and the Black Student Union was having a hard time. Women for Change is what we were called then. We're having a hard time. The Students for Gay Rights, because none of us were gay, of course, we were just students for gay rights, were having a hard time. And then some of the environmentalists, the anti-nukes at that time, so it was still what we were calling. And we formed a coalition. And we took over one of the student government associations there, and I was the president and the co-chair. That continued again in graduate school at Johns Hopkins University, which, of course, while Johns Hopkins certainly is an instrument of change for on healthcare, as students on the campus, there are still very few women faculty who are tenured. That still persists. There's wage gaps that still persist in that institution. The Black Student Union was also felt that very few people of color were in tenured positions. Again, they didn't even have a gay rights organization, but just started kind of when I was there. And once again, I formed and worked with people to form a progressive student alliance where, again, so this is now sort of 1992, where we came together and we took over the Graduate Student Association, and we started to move forward on things like making sure there was health care, making sure that people didn't ask the Taiwan, simple things like didn't ask the Taiwan Student Association and the Chinese Student Association about why they shouldn't have their moon festivals together. Which was actually a question that, when they would come for funding, there's two different groups. When the group that were in charge before us, they would just say, well, why don't we just have it together? And so once in our reign, once we took over, we understood those diversities, and we funded the Community Mediation Center, and we did these very cool things. So after that, I was set to just become, again, a professor. But I got sort of reignited when I was working as an analyst for the Secretary of State back in Maryland. I left the academy and just felt that, what would it be like to have policy as well as bringing the law in and being able to speak those languages. And so that's what I decided to come to office and be in this position. And one of the first pieces of legislation that I passed, I guess it was my second year, was banning the practice of shackling pregnant, incarcerated women in the state of Maryland. And again, that just to even know, yeah, you remember, I thought it was a mistake when I ran across it. I thought, well, surely we just forgot. But as you know, it took us 2.5 years, 2-3 years to get that bill passed. And so then that same year we voted marriage equality, and we only won by one vote. And so it sort of marked for me and also for you that one vote can matter, one person can, in coalition with other people, can absolutely make a difference.